we are going to talk about World War II and why World War II started. So, World War II started in 1939 and it ended in 1945. And it all started in Germany due to people being unhappy because of certain rules they had to follow after World War I had ended. And to begin with, the Germans had to pay for a lot of damages caused during World War I. And the Germans also lost some of their land and they were only allowed to have a small army. And this was all because they signed something called the Treaty of Versailles, and this is what ended World War I. Led by Adolf Hitler and his Nationalist Socialist Party, who some people call the Nazis, they took advantage of the chaos in Europe after World War I to strike Poland. He spoke with the German people and convinced them to let him be their leader, but he was working secretly with Italy and Japan, and they helped him to invade Poland in 1939. When it came to people in countries that were fighting, there were the Axis powers, which included Germany, Italy, Japan, and they were against the Allies, who were made up of France, Great Britain, the United States, the Soviet Union, and China. Another event that took the United States by surprise was the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. The Japanese made a sneaky attack on the US naval base in Hawaii. They killed over 2,300 soldiers that day, and this is the event that made the United States so angry that they got involved in World War II. The Germans were becoming really aggressive, but how did people stop them? So during the war, the Germans got confident and they invaded the Soviet Union. Although they won many battles at first, the Germans did not like the cold weather and the cold winters and the Russians being so eager to fight. This is where the Germans ended up retreating and running home back to Germany. With the Russians on Germany's tail, another battle that many talk about was the Normandy Invasion. In June 1944, the British and the American army marched the D-Day invasion of France on the coast of Normandy. After this battle, the Germans were surrounded and gave up once their leader Hitler was dead and the Russians reached Berlin. In Japan, it wasn't long before they gave up too. This was because America dropped 2 atomic bombs in August of 1945 on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. A lot of people died in World War II. Some say it's between 40 and 50 million people, but of course we don't know the actual figures, so no one can be really sure. As you can imagine, women had a very different life before the war than they had during World War II. When most of men in Britain were called to the army or they were sent away to fight, women stepped in to do the jobs that were left behind, the jobs that men were doing before they went to war. One of these groups was called the Land Girls, and they worked on farms to grow food. They looked after livestock, the animals, and they kept the buildings and grounds in good condition. As you can imagine, there wasn't very much food around, so every little bit had to be saved and used. Even if the food didn't taste very nice, it still had to be used. Clothes that were too small or had tears in them just had to be made, the women just had to fix them because there weren't many new things around them to buy. Everyone had to help each other get the things they needed to keep warm and healthy, and all this was the responsibility of the women. Many people, especially children who lived in the cities, were evacuated to the countryside for safety. And in cities, they had many air attacks, such as the Blitz, and this is why children mainly were sent away to the countryside. Bombs dropped by the German planes could flatten brick houses. So, can you imagine going to school one day and coming home and finding that your house is no longer there? Or can you imagine packing your bag for school and popping a gas mask in your bag to protect yourself in case of a gas attack? It's all things that these days don't happen, but that's what life was like. Farms in the country became busy communities of people who moved in to help use every little bit of land to grow food. They might have moved there because they didn't have a home anymore, or because they wanted to help out as much as they could around the country. 10 things that you should know about World War II and how it affected Britain are that during the war, World War II, Britain was called the Homefront. The war affected people not just fighting in armies or on the front line, but back in their own towns and neighborhoods as well. All the different plans and ways to get Britain through World War II was called the war effort. Helping the war effort meant anything from planting vegetables to making fighter planes. Because Britain was at war, it wasn't easy to get food or other supplies anymore. In 1940, a system called rationing was set up which made sure that everyone had a fair amount of food to eat, a fair amount of clothes to wear, and a fair amount of soap and hygienic products, as well as petrol and what was actually available. So rationing didn't end until 1954. Land girls were women from all over Britain who worked on the farms. They were helping to grow produce and food for the rest of the country. Not all men went overseas to fight. Some couldn't go. So instead they joined the Home Guard. And the Home Guard was made up of volunteers ready to defend Britain from a surprise enemy invasion. And the Home Guard was created in 1940. From September 1940 to May 1941, Britain was heavily bombed by enemy planes. That time is called the Blitz. And during the Blitz, it was very dangerous to live in cities because that's where most of the bombs were actually dropped. So many children were sent off to live in the country where for them it would have been safer. And these children are known as evacuees. People could protect themselves from enemy attacks by having a gas mask. That would allow them to breathe in clean air no matter how dirty or poisonous the air around them was after a bombing. So loud sirens would let people know that a bomb might go off soon and that they should run to the nearest air raid shelter. Bomb shelters were small, strong structures, and they were sometimes put underground. And it protected the people inside the bomb shelters from being hurt during explosions and bombings outside. And when the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, announced that the war was over on VE Day, People all over Britain celebrating by having street parties. Now, did you know the Land Girls were part of the Women's Land Army, which started in World War I, and it's best known for their work in World War II. One job that the Land Girls had was to kill rats. Rats were responsible for eating 2 million tons of food per year. The Home Guard was first called the Local Defense Volunteers, and Blitz is the German word for lightning. When an attack is made by planes, so instead of troops in tanks or ships, it is called an air raid. During the Blitz, Britain was attacked by air raids. Air raid shelters were usually about as big as a garden shed. In fact, some today are actually used as garden sheds, and sweets and treats were hard to get during the war. Children would eat carrot sticks instead of ice lollies, and the only sweets that were actually available and not rationed during the war were throat and cough sweets. And rationing continued until 1954, and this was 9 years after World War II actually ended. So there we have it. That's a brief overview of World War II and what life was like. Thank you very much.